Hi everyone, it's Tom again. I don't have a lot to say about the last parts of this week's reading, Dover Beach and Dover Bitch, but I do want to make a few comments and maybe explain a couple of words. So let's look at those poems real quickly. All right, let's start with the older poem, Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach. So Arnold was a British poet who lived from 1822 to 1888. He's the oldest writer we're going to be dealing with in this class. And I think the syntax of the poem actually shows this pretty clearly. Should also note that the poem was probably written sometime around the late 1840s, early 1850s. This roughly corresponds with Arnold's honeymoon in Dover, England, which is, perhaps you can tell, the locale described in Arnold's poem. So maybe this poem is at least somewhat autobiographical in that Arnold's speaker is addressing his love in the same place and situation to which Arnold brought his wife on his honeymoon. Though it was written in 1851-ish, it wasn't published until 1867. But I think if we look at the poem, we can see something that Arnold is known for, something called sweetness and light, which is his theory of what culture should be, that it should be modeled on things like beauty, intelligence, craft, rather than serving some kind of moralistic or materialistic purpose. So he wasn't about trying to save people's souls with poetry or culture. He wasn't about trying to make people money. What he really was interested in was the sort of significance of creating things that were beautiful and smart, and that a properly functioning culture would sort of gravitate to that kind of thing. So I think the interesting thing about the opening bit of the poem, we can see this sort of idea of beauty within it. I had a professor once who told me that Arnold had kind of a tin ear, that he was really not a great lyricist. But this poem is sort of an exception in that I think you can hear a kind of rhythmic tone that is reminiscent of the ocean, which is really the subject that Arnold is interested in here. So we just listen to the cadence of his poem. The sea is calm tonight, the tide is full, the moon lies fair upon the straits. On the French coast the light gleams and is gone. The cliffs of England stand, glimmering and vast on the tranquil bay. So just a little bit about the situation. They're at Dover, which is the closest point between the English Channel from the English side to the French side, so that you can see the coast, the English side of the channel, but also the French coast across the water. And it puts in mind Arnold to sort of meditate about life, the universe, and everything, right? And we can hear the sort of rhythmic pulse, the come and go of the coming tide or the waves going back and forth. The tide is full, the moon lies fair. It's a very rhythmic, easygoing poem. And Arnold, I think, works a great deal to try and get a sense of natural beauty from it. Just a few words and things toward the end. Tremulous, cadence, slow. Cadence is a tempo, but tremulous here is basically the same thing as trembling. And here the kind of motion of the water or the sea on the beach puts in mind for him a kind of ebb and flow of life, and for him that brings a sort of sense of sadness to what he's thinking about in this moment here with potentially with his wife. The second stanza in the poem includes an allusion to a much older work, a play by a poet called Sophocles, called Antigone. In that play, Sophocles makes a reference to the sea of faith and the misery which the oceans of the world, the ebb and flow, might reflect a kind of fortune of things ascending but then descending. So once again, there's sort of a note of sadness. But I think that the thing I want to note about this is that Arnold has this sort of notion of high culture or high art, right? He's trying to refer to ancient Greek writing and ancient Greek playwrights and tragedy. So he has this very high culture notion of what art should be. He's not trying to watch, say, like the Beverly Hillbillies or something like that. He's definitely on the higher end of opera and those sorts of things, right? So that is the kind of attitude he's trying to invoke here. As we move through the rest of the poem, I just want to explain a few terms that might have been confusing to make sure you get sort of basic meaning of Arnold's poem here. Basically, a girdle here is more or less a belt, right? So when Arnold says the sea of faith was once too at the full round earth shore, like lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled, it's like a tight belt cinched in around the waist, holding the world together. But we extend the metaphor, and the belt just sort of falls apart, and now it's just these loose strands that are running up the oceans, and we hear in the sort of retreating waves a kind of echo of faith, which he sees as sort of being dead long ago, right? The shingles of the world here, just I think a reference to the rocky coast. And then the conclusion of the poem, Ah, love, let us be true to one another, for the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy nor love nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, while ignorant armies clash by night. So we are like people caught up in a great war at nighttime where no one knows what is happening or what is going on. We lack a sort of sense of control or issue with our lives or what's happening. And therefore, what we really can contribute to the world, or what we have to the world, as Arnold is sort of trying to let us know, is our own faith in one another. So you see that the poem definitely is in its style and its attitude is trying to invoke this sort of high culture argument for the idea of beauty and truth to one another. So that is the kind of starting point for the second poem. The first poem, Dover Beach, is a meditation on a kind of loss of meaning within the world, but how within that loss of meaning do we as individuals, through our own actions to one another, find a kind of sense of smaller meaning within the relationships we establish. But Hecht's poem builds on that, right? Anthony Hecht is a much more recent poet. He only died like 15 years ago. And his poem is much more modern in its disposition. But you should know that the sort of dramatic situation that he invokes is the exact same one that Arnold is talking about, right? So we see the beginning of his poem. So there stood Matthew and Arnold and this girl with the cliffs of England crumbling away behind them. And he said to her, try to be true to me and I'll do the same for you, for things are bad all over, etc., etc. So you get from the very beginning of Hecht's poem, the latter poem, he is not trying to invoke the same tone. He doesn't necessarily want to, at least in this poem, invoke the same attitude of high culture. This is more like sort of common speak. And he's talking to us in cliches rather than trying to be eloquent or trying to be sort of precise in his language, right? It's just the way we talk to someone some other time. It's a poem very much about what we make of our old ideas of art that we've inherited from the past, right? And I'm sure you have a sense of this. Cultural artifacts, things like, Shakespeare, great paintings, or these things, these all sort of in some ways form impressions for us, but maybe they don't always seem relevant to our lives. And I think in some ways Hecht is playing off that idea here. I think the poem is otherwise not as hard to understand, but he's talking about Matthew Arnold and the girl, and their relationship is nowhere near as romantic in the way that Arnold describes it in the original poem. And I'll just let you see that through the text on yourself. But I do think it's interesting to think of some interpretive questions here. I mean, one way to think of Hecht's poem is that it's kind of satire, but that's usually not a very specific word. And I ask these questions both on the discussion board here in an effort to get you to try and be more precise. Because when we start talking about these sorts of things and start writing about them on your first paper, you're going to sort of need to make an argument, not just that Hecht's tone is satirical in some ways, but that he has a target for a satire. So if the poem is a kind of satire, what is it that Hecht's making fun of, right? There are a lot of possibilities. One thing it might be that he's trying to satirize Arnold's language, that it's too romantic, that it's too flowery, that it's too highfalutin in this world where we really don't care about those things. what we really care about are much more material concerns, right? So no sweetness and light. That could be one target. On the other hand, it might be that he's making fun not so much of Arnold, but the speaker of his own poem, right? As I said in the past, I think it's often a mistake to identify the speaker of a poem with the author. Speakers may not have the same attitudes or the same value system that the writer of the poem does. So perhaps Hecht here is trying to make fun of the speaker of his poem, in that all the vulgarity and all the kind of crass materialism and the sexism potentially of the speaker are found wanting when we compare them to the older sense of language. Or maybe he's just satirizing himself in his own way and his inability to see the world in romantic lights, right? If you were going to write on this poem and deal with this question, you might want to try and sort through at least one of those questions and try and come to a sense of, okay, what is it that Hecht is really targeting here? As I said, I don't have a lot to say about these poems. That's really all I want to give you. But I am very interested in what you make of them. So there are potential questions on the discussion board for you to answer and speak to here, and I will look forward to what you have to say.